Hi, welcome to the installment on Native Americans, which corresponds to Chapter 13, Section 3 in your textbook. Obviously, this is going to be about the Native Americans and the Plains Indians. Please take a moment and read this quote because really it kind of sets the tone for the entire section. One of the first things we're going to talk about are the Native Americans of the Plains. Now, we know that it's the railroads that brought miners, ranchers, and farmers, and with their arrival, they take Native American hunting grounds, they slaughter the buffalo, and this is really going to lead to a cause and effect relationship between them because as the railroads brought them, they took the land. As they came upon the land, they slaughtered the buffalo, and this is going to leave the Native Americans with no choice but to resist, and of course it leads to the deaths of many of the Native Americans. Lots of times these traders broke the treaties that they made with the Native Americans and they forced them to relocate to new territory. And one of the overriding questions that I would like for you to ask yourself as we go through this today is that if the settlers broke treaties with Native Americans, why do Native Americans abide by the treaties? And I think that is something that most students can understand. If we expect you to live by rules, then we ourselves as your teachers should abide by those rules. So I think that you kind of have an understanding of that for Native Americans. I have here that cause and effect relationship that I mentioned just a moment ago. Please take a moment, pause the PowerPoint, and see if you can answer that question. Now notice that there are two causes and one effect. What did I tell you were the two causes that led to the effect? Pause here, put that in your notebook. It goes in section 3 of your notebook. Here are the answers for you, so make sure that you make corrections to anything that you may have incorrect, and you will see this again in just a few moments. Now, one of the first conflicts is the Dakota Sioux Uprising, and it arose out of the denial by traders to give food to the Dakota Sioux. The Dakota Sioux had moved to the reservation in exchange for annuities, and annuities are just scheduled payments that the government paid them. But the traders would rip off the Native Americans by convincing the government that the Native Americans owed them money, and so when the government made the payment would go directly to the traders. And when confronted with the fact that many of the Dakota Sioux were starving and it was brought to the attention by their chief, they were told to let them eat grass or their own dung, which was a cruel response to what was going on by people who had been taking their money. Ultimately, in the end, it's going to lead to violence. The Dakota Sioux resist, and that same trader who had the cruel response about letting them eat grass was found dead himself with grass stuck in his mouth. I think that is quite a statement being made by the Dakota Sioux. Now, this uprising continued, and unfortunately it was waged against both the military and civilians, and by the time that it all came to a close, a military tribunal had sentenced 307 of the Dakota to death. President Lincoln shows some leniency and reduces it to 38. So what led to the Dakota Sioux Uprising? We talked about the cause and what led to that effect. So again, pause that here, put that in your notebook, try to answer those, and I'll show you the answer in just a moment. Here's the answer. The traders take their money, the traders deny them food, and as a result, the Dakota Sioux are forced to fight back. Make any corrections, and make sure that you have that in your notebook. Fetterman's Massacre is another conflict that arose, and basically, Native Americans are trying to protect their land, and so from the very beginning, they start attacking settlers along the Bozeman Trail that you can see pictured with the moving arrow there on your map. And basically, they were trying to keep them from getting established in the territory to start off with. They were led by 3 separate chiefs. You had Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, and I have them pictured here for you. But they came up with a plan where they drew Captain William Fetterman and his men into an ambush by making them think that they were chasing a raiding party. And of course, they were surrounded and of course killed by these 3 chiefs and their men. Now, the Sand Creek Massacre is another example of violence between the groups. It arose out of conflict between the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Native Americans and miners and settlers flocking to Colorado in search of gold and silver. And if you look at the arrow on the map, you see the location of where we are talking about. Miners flooded into Colorado searching for gold. Again, Native Americans are just trying to protect their lands. They've been forced onto these reservations, and along come the miners searching for that gold in violation of treaties. And so as a result, the Native Americans raid their mining camps and their ranches. They steal their horses and cattle. And it's going to escalate to the point where ranches are being burned and the violence is getting out of hand. And so trade is going to come to a standstill in this area. Ultimately, the territorial governor tells the Cheyenne to surrender or face attack. Many Cheyenne did, and there were still those out there that did not. Chief Black Kettle brought his men to Sand Creek to negotiate a peace. Notice it was not surrender. And so there were men, women, and children located there. And while they were waiting on someone who had the authority to negotiate with them, because the leader of the fort did not have that authority, Colonel John Chivington is ordered to attack the encampment, which in turn kills many men, women, and children of the Cheyenne people. Things are getting out of hand. You have the Indian Peace Commission. It is created by the federal government to identify the causes of the violence between Native Americans and Americans. And of course, Congress itself is identified as being one of the causes because of their lack of protection, their lack of fulfillment to treaties and obligations. And of course, they talk about the encroachment on lands by settlers, and it talks about the violence, of course, of the Native Americans. The Indian Peace Commission basically hammered out 3 different treaties. They are all grouped together with one name called the Medicine Lodge Creek Treaties. But basically, Native Americans are forced into signing treaties that created 2 large reservations, one for the Plains Native Americans and one for the Sioux. And this is where they agree to move on to the reservations, and they give up their lands. Not everybody, not all Native Americans are going to move to the reservations. One of the things that the Native Americans have resisted is the loss of being able to hunt the buffalo. And this is what many Native Americans depended on for survival. And I have here pictured is Buffalo Bill, William Cody, who was one of the most prolific buffalo trappers of his day. And basically he represents this ideal of the annihilation of the buffalo. He was hired by the Army to kill buffalo for the meat for workers, to kill buffalo to keep them from blocking the tracks. And the Army discovered that if they killed off the buffalo, then it severely hampered the Native Americans' ability to survive. And so they were encouraged to kill the buffalo. Passengers from trains oftentimes shot buffalo from the trains for sport. And of course, you also had those like the trappers who were encouraged by the Army to kill the buffalo, and you had trappers who were making quite a bit of profit off the hides of the buffalo by shipping them back east. How did they use the buffalo? Here is a graphic showing you all the different ways that they used the buffalo. So please take a moment and review that. It is really impressive with all the different uses that they had for the buffalo. And one of the last battles between Native Americans and American soldiers is going to be the Battle of Little Bighorn. It is going to arise out of the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota. This was on a reservation, once again, that the Lakota Sioux had been forced to live on. Some of the Lakota Sioux were there, and basically we go back to that question, if the Americans are not going to abide by the treaties, then why should the Lakota Sioux abide by the treaties? And so many of them left the reservation to hunt the buffalo. And it's going to result in a terrible battle, and it's going to result in disastrous consequences for Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his men. Sitting Bull, who was the chief, had performed what was called the sun dance, and this is where he cut his arms. He would raise them up and he would do a dance for like 2 days. He would go into a trance, and when he woke up, he revealed that he had had this vision with the white men upside down on their horses, indicating that the Native Americans were going to be successful in an attack against the Americans. And Custer made the mistake of attacking a larger contingent of Native Americans with a smaller force, and as a result, Custer and all of his men are killed. Now, unfortunately, Custer is portrayed as a victim. Sitting Bull is forced to flee to Canada. Some of the Lakota Sioux agree to go back to the reservation, but of course, Custer and his men are dead. Another group is the Nez Perce. They were led by Chief Joseph, and they refuse to return to the reservation, and they flee. And they go for over 1,300 miles. They are gone for so long that they get stuck in a harsh winter. Many of his people are starving to death. They're freezing to death. And so Chief Joseph finally surrenders, and his followers are exiled to Oklahoma. And he is very famous for his quote that I will fight no more forever, because he is tired of the death that is brought about on his people. And the defeat of the Nez Perce really represented the defeat of all Native Americans. Finally, you have the battle at Wounded Knee Creek. It came about because Native Americans were doing what was called the ghost dance. And again, this was a ceremonial dance in which they prayed to whatever entity it was that they prayed to, that the buffalo would come back, their ancestors would come back, and they would do away with the white man and return things to how they were before the white man encroached upon their lands. And the government agents blamed Sitting Bull because he had returned to the reservation from Canada. They send government agents in to arrest Sitting Bull, but Sitting Bull's supporters open fire, and Sitting Bull is killed as they resist his arrest. The remaining Lakota Sioux flee to Wounded Knee Creek, and again they are caught, as you can tell, in this winter. They have men, women, and children with them. They are going to surrender, and gunfire breaks out. 25 Americans are killed, over 200 Lakota men, women, and children are killed, and really this is the last battle of the Plains Wars. A policy of assimilation is put into place, and assimilation is this idea that the minority culture is to be absorbed into the dominant culture. And really, that came about out of, I think, some misguidance by people who wanted to help. Helen Hunt Jackson had written a book in which she exposed all of the injustices against Native Americans and how they had been defrauded and outright murdered in defense of these treaties that no one really adhered to. And so well-meaning Americans said, well, we'll just teach them how to do the white ways, and that's not necessarily what Native Americans wanted. Unfortunately, assimilation becomes government policy with the passage of the Dawes Act. And basically what the Dawes Act does is it divides the reservations into allotments of either 160 acres for farming or 320 acres for ranching. The remaining land of the reservations would be sold to settlers, and then that profit would be put into an account for Native Americans to purchase things like farming implements, machines, and things that they needed to be successful farmers. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Native Americans simply were not suited to the white farmer way of life. They had no interest in it. They would rather be on the plains, following the buffalo, and living that nomadic lifestyle. They were defrauded. Native Americans never received any of the money from the sale of the lands. And the remaining lands for Native Americans were useless for farming because the prime land had been taken by the settlers, and they had left the infertile or the really hostile lands for the Native Americans. And so the plan was really doomed for failure from the start. Another aspect of this is going to be the assimilation of Native American children into white culture. You have those leaders who came up with this idea of kill the Indian and save the man. Breed or teach out of Native Americans that Native American culture. And so they'll be taught that their cultural traditions were superstitious and backward. And unfortunately, this creates a whole generation of Native American children who are going to be caught between these two cultures. They didn't fit into white culture because of racism. They did not fit into the Native American culture because they had been raised in the white tradition and not in the Native American tradition. So, unfortunately, there is no real solution for Native Americans in this instance. They have been treated unfairly by the American government, by people coming out to the West, and there was no solution for that. And that is the way history records it. In the end, Native Americans are going to be overwhelmed by superior numbers, and they just lose their ability to fight back. This is the end of Chapter 13, Section 3, the Native Americans. Please make sure that you have your notes in your notebook. Goodbye.